Hello, Jahnavi. Thank you very much for joining me in this project. Dr. Jahnavi Phalkey, I'll give you a short introduction, is a filmmaker and historian of science and technology. She's had a full academic career. She was at the India Institute at King's College London, where she was teaching. And she was also external curator at the Science Museum London. But more than that, she is now the founding director, a passionate founding director of the Science Gallery Bengaluru, which has had some extraordinary exhibitions, the types of which I think we have not seen in India before. This crossover, we'll talk about those exhibitions. And she's an academic, a curator, a cross-disciplinary practitioner, and a passionate follower of all questions which concern us today. So welcome, Jahnavi. Thank you for joining me. And as you know, it's a chat.
Yes.
So we're going to chat, and we can start with you saying something, or you want to start in any particular way. You're welcome to do that.
Sure. So thank you first for having me. It's a fabulous opportunity to be in conversation with you, I deeply admire your practice, and that's also why it's a double privilege to be here and to discuss things that you and I think about. You in more direct ways, me in sort of more indirect ways with the exhibition. So I'm not engaged at this moment in direct research in those arenas, but all the same, I'm deeply invested in actually the questions, right, that surround it. So I think the first thing that I'd like to say is, when I looked at the pictures you shared, the photographs that you shared, right, like as sort of provocations, or maybe just starting points, or like some of them actually felt like resting states for just think, not even think, just feel, right? Like I'm thinking of images like captivity or growth, they just evoked a moment of just let go and think, okay, so what is it, and I think that I those two images I deeply enjoyed. They I felt them viscerally in many ways. And the first thought that came to my mind is, as you mentioned, I'm trained as a historian of science. I came from the humanities to the history of sciences, and of course many of my colleagues come from the sciences to history of science. So both journeys have their own have their own beauty, have their own ability to contribute to knowledge in history of science, but also, more broadly. And so the first thought that came to my mind is, we want to have this chat about science and nature, right? And as we sort of, as I remember, my learning in history of science, and my classmates who were doing sociology of science, so sort of, more in the social sciences than in the humanities, science and nature, and then they would work with nature and culture, right? And so when the two things kind of came to my mind as I read through your note and looked at the pictures, I was thinking, okay, so this is something as a historian of science I have known. Science firmly fits into the box of culture as a social enterprise and as a cultural activity. But often in other kinds of debates, it's science and culture that are juxtaposed, or sometimes even posed as in opposition to each other, right? And so that inherent tension in science of being a cultural activity and having a certain kind of relationship to culture, but also to nature, and the relationship that nature has to culture, right? Because the relationship between nature and culture is a broader relationship than that of only to science, for example, right? And so that was kind of, so that little mess started unraveling in my mind as I started, looking at your photographs and thinking of, okay, so, there is this moment when you can so easily put science in the box of culture, and there's another moment when you no longer are able to do that, right? And that kind of made me go back into what it is that I have tried to do as a historian of science, and then more recently, recent, it took me a long time to make my film, but more recently as a filmmaker, is that I actually saw, and I'm not the only one, the kind of beauty that one usually associates with things natural, also in things, not, or man-made, right? Like the objects that I study, like, be it cyclotrons, be it, payloads for space rockets or whatnot, and there are colleagues of mine who work in, broadly what we call an archaeology of science, right? Like looking at sort of museum objects, looking at labs and how they, cannibalize and collect, and old objects get remade into new objects, etc. And there is a certain beauty to those incredible objects that have been made. They embody the complexity of human thought. They embody the desires and ambitions to learn more about nature, because in most cases, laboratory equipment are, our engagement with the physical world in constricting ways, and ways that we will, of course, discuss more about as we go forward. Because what does science do to nature, in a sense, right? And instruments of study are, of course, an integral part of it. And then, so what does one, how does one deal with that, right? Like how, especially now at this moment, when the urgency to reimagine the nature of our relationship to nature is so critical, right? Like to recognize that urgency and to begin that work of reimagination. And it'll happen on all sorts of fronts, right? It'll happen through conversations, it'll happen through research agendas, and it'll happen through what we do with science in the public. And that is sort of that idea. I mean, that idea, which we can probably come back to later, is what informs the way I'm trying to shape Science Gallery in Bangalore, right? Like at the heart of it is really, how do we reimagine our relationship to research and therefore to nature, right? Because what is research? It is about understanding the physical world around us, our universe, our planet, no matter what disciplinary approach you take, right? And so reimagine that, and therefore reimagine that relationship, which has become so critical. But I think that's my, so that's, to sum up, I think that's my first thought, right? Like the tension between science and culture, despite belonging to the same box, and then the complexity of the relationship to nature, and the fascinating, the complex and often enticing beauty that even objects that study science and therefore aim to capture it in a way themselves possess.
Right. And as a historian of science, this trajectory between these boxes you mentioned, nature, culture, science. I'm thinking of Plato's cave also, where the informant becomes, it comes back. And so this is an old trajectory, but at some point it starts becoming very dominant in the way we think of the world and the way we understand or rationalize the world as what it should be.
Yeah.
And it has a deep impact in the way those relationships would change because of the way we relate, we understand something. And also it kind of ties into with the history of capital, in a sense, of nature as capital, in a sense. And when you're saying this relationship, which you want to bring out now in the shows you're doing, this science, knowing, educating what this is, but they're also very physical objects. You use the word beauty. Very physical objects. So there is a step outside of the rational into something we call beauty and aesthetics and ways of knowing which are not captured by those values which science brings in. And so why do you believe that? What brings you to that space of saying there's more to say about this relationship than what science has already said, that water is not just a bunch of values of parameters of X, Y, or Z, that it is something more than that. And then you go into this cultural ways of knowing something, which is an affective way. So this is a very interesting kind of thing you're pointing us towards when you talk of this crossover. And I'm trying to come to the thing, why this crossover? What is driving you to think of it like this?
Yeah. Interesting. I don't think I've ever ever and ever. I don't think I've articulated it before. I'll try. So I think in many ways, the problem that you identify, right? Like, I mean, the history of science and the history of capital in many ways cannot be, separated, just like the history of industry and engineering and technology cannot be separated from the history of capital. When does the problem, in a sense, arise, or where do we identify the problem? I think the problem, in many ways, within that box called culture, arises when the cultural authority of science in many ways supersedes or exceeds the authority of any other cultural activity, right? Like, so any other form of cultural or artistic expression, in a sense, is seen to be less than or less important than or less relevant than the cultural authority that science possesses, in a sense of organizing the world around us, right? And I think that for many of us is so to speak, the moment of a big tension, right? Like, how do you work with that? How do you work with that tension for a meaningful discussion, right? Like, not one that sort of denies and says, goes down the path of vaccines don't work, or flat earth, or and I'm choosing extreme examples in order to make the point, which is to say that, so how do you assign or apportion appropriate cultural authority to science as a social enterprise, and also therefore in what other scholars have called apportion epistemic justice to other ways of knowing? And I think there again, so what I found difficult to grasp is that the debate seldom moves further than a call for epistemic justice, right? And the underlying or implicit assumption is that this is not going to happen because the cultural authority of science is, in a way, subsuming all of this. And I think in that, what is implicit often is that other forms of cultural authority or other ways of knowing are antagonistic, incompatible, incommensurable, and invalid, right, in relationship to science. And I think in not actually doing the hard work of identifying where any of these things are actually true or not, that's going to help us move forward, right? Like, so epistemic justice is served by not only calling for it, which is important, the call for it is important, but I think one needs to move beyond the polemic to do the hard work to actually understand where do these ways of knowing intersect. Do they, that unfortunate word encounter, because it often just reminds me of police encounters in Bombay, right? I mean, I grew up in the 90s Bombay, where encounter meant
not a productive word.
It's not a productive word, because also the assumption is that this meeting has never happened before, and these two entities are unknown to each other.
Right.
And that is simply not true. Otherwise, the idea of emptiness and null and zero would never make it from, between the Indian, what is India, or between the Indian subcontinent and the Arabian world and the Greek world and the European world, and so on and so further. Cultures have been in contact. Ways of knowing have been in contact, in transaction, in conversation for a very long time. The cultural authority of what we today understand as science is one that has been established at the back of a political conquest, right? So it doesn't render sort of, what is misidentified as truly Western, because too many things have flown into it before and during its consolidation, during the consolidation of its cultural authority, for it to be identified as fully Western. And so, but its ascent is most certainly connected with the ascent of Europe as a political and military authority. And so to conflate and subsume all of it is to do disservice to ways of knowing, disservice to science, disservice to earlier ways of knowing, which actually had a free pass to different places, right? I mean, texts were translated from various languages to various languages. And the examples I can use is that the third known foreign language translation of Newton's Principia was in the court of the Nawab of Awadh into Persian.
Wow.
The first two were into French and Russian. Right? I think so. Or English and Russian. Right? I forget that. But, it was the third known. So this is the thing, right? Like texts are flow. So people had a free pass, right? Like, and of course, circulation, which is, an idea that my colleague Kapil Raj uses to talk about how, ways of knowing and knowledge flowed between cultures. Now, of course, there are power equations involved,
right.
And of course there are barriers, the knowledge doesn't flow freely. There are barriers, there are political barriers, there are military barriers, there are, wealth barriers, all sorts of things are there. Not alien to us. We can identify them very well. They're not incomprehensible. But that having said, to identify something as having literally grown and consolidated and originated only in Europe, without anybody in the world knowing or understanding and then encountering it, is a myth, which serves nobody, right?
So there's a big colonization impulse and the military and political power, which leads to this dominance.
Yeah.
But the dominance is never in isolation to the ongoing interaction and conversation, but it just becomes the dominance to serve other interests.
Precisely.
Maybe the colonization interests.
Absolutely. And then to put ways of knowing which otherwise, or to put, so to speak, earlier conversations and earlier exchanges into the same framework and under the same light as this particular moment is historically incorrect. And it's doing a disservice to all of the work that, people all over the world did in order for, the kind of data that reached Newton or the kind of data that reached Linnaeus, in order for them to do that kind of classificatory work.
Yeah.
All of this work was happening, in fields and elsewhere. So, in the end, it becomes a story of resources. It becomes a story of political power. That's not to take away, again, it's not to take away the fabulous breakthroughs and the works that the Europeans did undertake, but to say that this is therefore an encounter with something so alien that it is incommensurable, antagonistic, and subsuming of, and all of those things of any other ways of knowing, is basically setting ourselves up for a conversation that's false.
This idea of creating very isolated narratives, historical narratives, is also, it continues to this day when we don't recognize innovation as something which is happening across the board, and of course they're breakthroughs in a sense, but it's part of a field of interactions and exchanges which are happening all the time. This idea of moments in time when something happens. Charles Darwin also did not do that in isolation in the late 19th century.
Absolutely.
There was Humboldt before that, and there were other people. They must have interacted with all the indigenous people in South America and everything. There must be so much going on which has never been. And of course, part of the decolonization project is to retrieve these and of course you do it very well in your film, in the Cyclotron, when you see this interface of how these histories of science, who went there to MIT and learned and came back. So this is very, very important point you raise about the constant interaction, the encounter being one way. I'm thinking whether this also becomes a methodological problem, because then science as it exists now in terms of what we call Western science or science, and the other ways of knowledge, there's a very different methodology of that knowing. And they almost incommensurate with each other. And if you think that is part of the problem, how do we go beyond it? Because when we are now talking of these new assimilations of other ways of knowledge in the ecological crisis moment, I often say that we can bring these two kinds of ways of thinking to the room, but how are we going to talk? What's the translation going to be? And so beyond the calling out into the new creation of new understanding, this is something you want to reflect on.
Yes. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said methodological, right? And I think the methodological applies to our ways of knowing these stories rather than the methodologies of ways of knowing inherent to science or knowledge systems that predate what we today understand as modern science, right? So I think our way of knowing these stories, I mean, the way disciplines have naturalized, the way universities have grown, the way, again, in conjunction with where cultural authority lay, which, it has in Europe for several years. I mean, the later half of the 20th century saw that shift a little bit. And we can, we may or may not talk about that, but nonetheless, I mean, this is where, this is where the in a way, the intellectual authority for defining disciplines, for for understanding or shaping knowledge, lay in a way. And so, to give you sort of, or to give our friends who will probably listen to us and a hook into it, I trained as a historian of science. I had colleagues who worked on the United States, on the Soviet Union, on Finland, on Great Britain, on Germany. Those who worked on parts of Europe and United States of America can call themselves historians of science and apply for jobs which have titles like 20th Century History of Science. If you work on Korea, you work on India, you work on Ghana, you're automatically working on a specificity. So the burden of location is on us, right? The identifiers are with us. So I might have sat through the graduate coursework of 3 years of training, of giving exams. We read the same books, we had the same professors, we took the same courses. Some of us did better than others, in terms of just engaging with the text, the standard thing that happens in grad school. But at the end of the day, I'm a historian of science of India. My colleague who works on the United States is a historian of science.
Wow.
With a specialization in America, right? And so this is at play in our way of organizing disciplinary knowledge, right? As my dear friend Helen Celine used to say, she put together an encyclopedia volume on the history of science in non-Western cultures, right? It's an irony, but one that did not escape her. Where she started her presentation at the launch of the volume by saying, there's history of science and the rest is anthropology, right? And so her volume was anthropology. Why? Because historical explanation in anthropology resides in culture. Historical explanation in history lies in a coming together of a range of explanatory tactics. So when you're writing history, you're in a way, so basically you people like me or people who work on Ghana or Argentina or Mexico we're doing culture is the explanation. So when you write a manuscript, even on 20th century science in India or in Ghana or Mexico, the question is 2-3 questions. One, how does this relate to, or how is this relevant to the larger story? Meaning the larger story of Europe and North America. What does this add to our knowledge about physics? It doesn't matter that you might be studying about physics in the backwaters of Germany, but it still belongs in the larger picture. You might be writing about the biggest lab in India or Ghana or Mexico. It belongs in culture, right? And so I think this is critical, right? What I call like the journey from relational to symmetry, right? To look at answering these questions not in relation to somebody else's story, right? Like so to tell histories of places, other places in a manner where you're not trying to make them relevant to a narrative and a temporality that belongs or is taken ownership of by Europe and North America, but where you give this place its due in terms of symmetrically looking at it with the same eyes to say, what does this tell us about, larger historical processes? What kind of insights does it give us? And, given the number of people who live in places like China and India, we ought to be looking at it. It's the bulk of the human population, So I mean, even for that reason alone, it would be valuable to explore, as our colleague and Chinese historian Arbin Wong says, the limits of European experience. So I think it's a long-winded way to answer your question. What I'm trying to say is that deeply embedded in our quest for epistemic justice are two things. One is to retrieve stories, which is required. So I'm not saying that's not required, but also to do that hard work of judgment, right? And judgment based on things you observe. All stories are not equal, but right now they are not equal on the basis of cultural authority and power. We need to turn the axis to something else. Where are they not equal for, right? Like in terms of what do they tell us about the human condition and what do they not tell us about the human condition, right? So the axis for evaluating these stories or understanding or making a judgment call on these stories, right? Like as to why is this story valuable or why might we consider this actually not valuable, right? Speaking to the point that you said about, or even speaking to the point that I made earlier, about, of course, if you dive deep into history, you will find stories about flat Earth. You will find stories even today, which, ask you to look at vaccination with more skepticism than we are. So how do you, what is that axis around which you will value these stories? And those axes should, work for the past and for, the last 400 years. I mean, the deeper past and the last 400 years as well. If we want to do that, if we want to do the real work of epistemic justice in a sense, right? Like to understand how people have understood the world around them for, for the time that we were able to know it for, retrievable stories, retrievable archaeology, retrievable history, and then collectively arrive at those metrics, for lack of a better word, or our criterion for evaluating the stories, for accepting them, for an honest dialogue on why we don't want to accept certain stories, and kind of move forward. So I think that again, that hard work, of the rejection, right? Like, because like some of our colleagues in the UK now say, right, like, racism is not multicultural, right? Like in a sense that you can't just retrieve everything and say it's valid because it's different to what is being enforced, right? Like so X has power, it is being enforced, or it is seen to be enforced. We don't want X, therefore we propose Y and A and Z. But Y and A and Z, you want to know what they are.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying are they equal to the X that is being imposed. I'm just saying what are our criterion for evaluating what we want, and therefore then see if X is not acceptable, then what of Y, A, and Z are also not acceptable to us. Yeah. Right? And I think that bit of work is where we are all a bit.
It's all, I think it so much links with the nature question.
Yes.
To me, in the terms of the construction of the idea of nature, which follows closely with this power and influence axis. And you said the limits of European
experience,
and I would say the growing limits of European influence now. So,
yes.
in a sense, the world is changing, but then this axis is not necessarily changing alongside so easily, because from the power, the axis of power and influence, you're talking more like an epistemological axis where things are knowledge is evaluated in its own terms, on terms which are not important to the idea of what knowledge is. It requires a different kind of listening also.
Yes.
And I want to bring you to this question, which you do in your in the science gallery now, because I see many of them embedded in your approach to the science gallery. And then you come these, I think, 3 shows which I know: Contagion, and Water on the Water,
Submerge,
and there was another one in the middle.
Phytopia.
all three deal with idea of nature.
Yes.
All three of them.
Yes.
And in a cross-disciplinary way. And you're trying to tell other stories. I've seen one of your shows in physically and then both online.
Yeah.
And I think they are very, very important shows because they are trying to break a narrative, what you're describing, and tell other stories in different ways. And so how did, in the Science Gallery, Bangalore, this emphasis on this science and nature connect, and what you just said about changing the axis of how we understand and listen to other stories. How do you think of this? And what do you think of this kind of understanding of it? What do you have to say about it?
Yeah. So it's, we're very young. I mean, we are 4 exhibitions old. And as you rightly pointed out, 3 of them have been, actively involved with, reconceptualizing our relationship or reconceptualizing the relationship of research and the public, science and the public. So that is the work, that is the work I'm trying to do at the gallery, right? So one of the things, I'll come to the shows in a second. One of the early decisions I took, right, like of what would it take to create public engagement where scholars and artists come together and their collaboration produces a form of public engagement. How does one do that in a country where almost all higher education is in silos, right? Indian Institute of Science, Indian Institute of Technology, National Center for Biological Sciences, School of Planning and Architecture, CEPT, etc., right? Like, so the chance of a young person having a roommate in the dorm, if they are a physicist, to have a cinematographer as a roommate, or having lunch with a historian, or directing the annual play with, a chemist and a theater person, or, this is just not there, right? The serendipity of meeting people who do other things with passion and depth, that view, that perspective is simply not there. So you're growing up, getting deeply involved in particular areas into silos without any understanding of what it takes to do another discipline, what drives those people, and why their work might be valuable, right? So how to do that here was a very, very important question for me. And so the first, in fact, decision that I took was that the Science Gallery will become a place not only to showcase collaboration or the coming together of scholars and artists, and scholars from the human and natural sciences, and artists and engineers and designers. Because if this would become a place for showcasing such things, we would be showcasing work happening elsewhere for the next 10 years, right. 15 years. There are so few people who work at the threshold, right, individually, or work in collaboration with people, in another discipline, that we would either be showing the same people or we'd be showing mostly things from elsewhere. So the decision I took was that we will have a public laboratory complex. And that laboratory complex with real labs equipped at postgraduate level would do that work, where you then encourage the collaboration. So it doesn't showcase, but it actually delivers the collaboration. And the showcasing, of course, comes along, right? And so what we have among the 5 labs is a natural sciences lab, which is not biology, not physics, not chemistry, a natural sciences lab, more a 19th century lab than a 21st century lab, because the impetus should be
pre-discipline, almost.
Exactly, pre-disciplined in every which way. Beautiful word, by the way, just beautiful word. So the impetus should be, or the provocation should be to reimagine questions about nature. Take a step back from, like, that level of, minutiae. And one is grateful for that too, I mean, that has meant we have, a range of tools at our disposal today that makes life, easier to live for those of us who might suffer from conditions, etc. But to take a step back and say we also need spaces to reimagine the relationship to nature, and therefore the natural sciences lab. We have a materials lab to think about materials for the future, what would it take? So, in a way, they're almost consequential labs. I hope in an ideal universe they unfold that way. I have no idea, because you can't tell people what to do. You can have an imagination, the structure can nudge, and then, things happen. But a materials lab with sort of, the usual, the milling machine, the lathes also, but an indoor sort of more delicate lab with, the 3D printers and the CNC cutters and, all of that. And then we have a food lab, because at the end of the day, inherent to reimagining your relationship to nature is, if you look at a range of indicators from the carbon footprint to what we eat and how we eat and how much we waste, and so a place to explore the food cycle, right? Like from seed to sort of recycling.
Very critical.
So absolutely critical. And as I say, in India, I say it jokingly, it's only partially true, is that in India we live to get married and to eat. Those are the two things that drive us culturally. So, food, I imagine, will be a vibrant space. Then we have a new media lab, because the way things are moving, it would be hard to leave something like that out, right? Like, and new media, not only in terms of, this, media that enable sort of the realization of or a public enactment of the self theatrically on a daily basis in social media, from that to the augmented reality, virtual reality expressions, etc. Right? All of that work happens on this thing that I'm speaking to you on, right? Like this one computer. So we, it is a technology of the moment. I can't say of the future, because I think things are changing too rapidly for me to have any grasp on them. And then we have a theory lab, which is sort of a blank collaboration space where we are hoping, a physicist and a choreographer and a psychologist and whoever will come, and they'll spend a year together and they'll do whatever they want, right? Like, so we're not even structuring it with equipment. We're saying, take this space, tell us what you need in it, and do what you want. So that's the theory lab. And then finally, we have a black box theater, which is experimental in that it is rigged for all kinds of sound, data, light, and lasers. So you can study kinetics, you can realize your AR, VR experiences in there. And on a regular day, you can, have a jam session or a theater or whatever. So this is sort of, so how do you enable that? How do you enable how do you nudge the rethinking of that relationship with nature in a public space, right? And so the exhibition halls and the labs are interspersed. So you can't see the exhibitions without passing the lab and, seeing the mess, the grease, the noise inside, right? Like, so that's the way we've structured the whole place. But that reimagination needs, how do you, again, I'm using words which my colleagues in the art world and in the humanities will shoot me for, but how do you operationalize rethinking that imagination, right? Like, and
very useful.
It is a useful word, because because otherwise I'm just speaking, right? And I love speaking, and that's it.
It's become militarized, but we can take that out of it. It's how to make something
absolutely.
real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do you make it real? How do you say, okay, let's rethink our relationship to nature, and then, okay, so what do you do then? I've thought about it, done, right? Like, no, you've got to redesign experiments. You've got to you have to ask new questions. How will you ask those questions? How will you, you'll ask the question. How will you answer those questions, and then what will you do with the answers? So I think that lab complex is informed by that desire, and therefore the nudging is to do all of this, all of the little things that I just spoke about. And in more ways than one, we're taking that mindset also to the public engagement program, to the exhibition halls that are interspersed between the labs, to say that we will have exhibitions that also do similar work of creation of a dialogue, to bridge the distance between research and the public. And how does it do that? What do disciplines do? What does research do? It constitutes and explores objects of inquiry, right? And the only way to bridge that distance, to my mind, I'm happy to be challenged because it will only sharpen my own thinking, is the only way to bridge that distance, or the only way to bridge that distance is to provide the public an insight into how knowledge gets made.
Yeah.
Right? And not a demonstration, where, you kind of say, this has happened, but where they're able to draw inferences from what they're shown, what they are, asked to experience, etc., etc. So what we do is the starting point or the theme for the exhibition is usually an object of inquiry. Yeah. In many ways, it's not as conceptual as many, or where the art world is going, for example, right? Or where sort of, how should I even put it? But it's not where the art world is today, or it's not where the public engagement world is today, in a sense, right? Like we're still not still. We are doing conceptual work. We're doing it anew. We are doing it in very interesting ways. And as a visitor myself, of course, I do enjoy a play of words and interesting ideas, etc. But here, the goal is to help people grasp what happens. Why is science done the way it's done? The human and the natural sciences both. And so what we do, so the object of inquiry is the starting point, and then we assemble a range of things around it. So there's the exhibit. Let's take one exhibit. In the first instance, we crack it open at the back end to lay bare the creative process that went into it, right? Like what was the scholarly process, which is creative, or the artistic process, right? So what's the creative process behind this coming into being? Yeah. And then we have, of course, we organize, workshops and masterclasses with the maker, the scholar / artist, etc., so that our visitors have the opportunity to talk to them and understand. So not only make it visible through actually having a section which is literally bluntly called process, yeah, but also have those conversations, and then use the exhibit to also ask new questions through workshops, masterclasses, lectures, etc. in the exhibition, right? Like, so the exhibit becomes a pivot for doing a range of knowledge things, right? I'm just calling them things, range of things. Now, just to give you an example of our public lecture series, for Submerge, we had 15, you came and, you delivered a fabulous lecture there. For Contagion, more recently, we had 21 lectures because we're living through a pandemic. So, the urgency and the relevance and the need for knowing was so much more higher than in Submerge. And of course, was being done differently. It was being done online. But what we've done in both cases is we got people across disciplines and practices. So we got curators, we got artists, we got, yeah. So let's look at Contagion now, right? Like, or even Submerge. We got for Submerge, we got fluid dynamicists, we got chemists, we got physicists, we got ecologists. We got yourself as an artist. We got a curator. We got a geologist. We got a historian. In fact, we got two. We had a cultural theorist, all of whom were talking about water in their disciplines, right? So we had someone talking about water and life. We had someone talking about making clouds. We had someone talking about glaciers. We had someone talking about why rivers should flow to the sea, and the disappearance of the Saraswati, the sort of multifaceted geological and historical biography of the Brahmaputra, and we had people who attended every single one of those lectures, right? And so what you see is, how do different disciplines understand water? And where does it come together and why? And that coming together work was often done in the tutorial sessions for the young people, where they got the chance to ask these questions to the speaker, right? So in the case of Contagion, for example, we have had modelers, physicians, clinicians, curators, and it's the same thing, right? Like the sociologists, historians speaking about these. So it's giving an insight into the making of knowledge is, so laying bare what's been found, then asking questions about why it was done in the way it was done and why it matters, is the first step towards enabling any kind of critical questioning of why does hydrology study water the way it does? Why do some disciplines take water only as a resource? Why is the beauty of the physicists and chemists work with water, which looks at it as the weirdest substance, get lost? Why does that not reach everyone, right? Like, so I think that, trying to crack that space open, by doing this work. And So we did it for water, we did it for plants, we did it for the world of plants, and then for transmission of diseases, emotions, behaviors, to make it a little more padded, so that it didn't become too heavily about diseases. In which, of course, we also, one of the running thread was zoonosis, for example, or One Health, right? Like, what does it mean for animals and plants and human beings to live together? When do those boundaries get transgressed, and what is that transgression, right? Like, when do you call it transgression and why, right? Or things like, why can we learn more about antibiotics from ants? Why are plant viruses important? Why do we always talk about animal viruses, etc.? So I think the goal is because asking questions like why is, if you go back to the sort of paradigmatic arguments about nature being classified, conquered, extraction, mobilization, capital, done, right? And find an alternative to this. Right. Can't do that. Can't do that. I mean, you're talking to a chemist about, this weird thing.
Yeah.
That is water, or talking to a fluid dynamicist who makes clouds in a chamber in his lab, right? Where is that going to go, right? Like, so that battle line is a false one.
Yeah.
It's a false one because we don't know what's happening, right? And so I think knowing more and then more sharply drawing the lines of where the battle really lies is critical to win that battle.
Right.
Because it has to be won. I don't think we have a choice.
Outline the boundaries very clearly.
Yes.
The approach and epistemological boundaries or the methodological boundaries.
Yes.
To go beyond them. So, but what has been your experience with the outcome of only three? Okay, what is the outcome? Feedback. You have students' interactions with the speakers. I know that from experience at the end of it. What has been your experience about what gets created in the minds of those who participate? And say one person who has gone through all the lectures.
Yep.
How does that? Is there some transformation for potential there? Yeah. Of course, there's potential, but have you any? It might be early days, but what is your hope around this?
Yeah, hope lots.
Hope lots.
Hope is, revolution, right? Yeah. But surprise. Surprise is what we see with many of them, right? Like, and the young they literally get, how should I put it? They literally get high like on sugar, right? Because they have then questions. Lots of questions. So surprise is something we've seen. For those of who have managed to come to, a range of lectures and not just come to the discipline where they felt, they understood or wanted to know more, but came through a range. And when we talk to them, surprise is the one thing we find coming back to us again and again. They feel comfortable. That's the sense we got. That's not the word they use. Surprise is a word they've used. Comfortable is not a word they've used. But we find them sort of expressing some kind of comfort because there is no competition, evaluation, judgment, assessment associated with this. And so what drives them is just like, okay, what's happening? Let me see. And then, so it's self-driven. It's in a way a journey they make themselves voluntarily. And so they seem to engage with comfort. So they've expressed things like it's good because, there is no whatever. I mean, I felt like reading because I knew this wasn't an exam, that kind of thing. So that's the other thing we felt. But like you say, it's early days. It is early days. The tutorial sessions, which we have for the young adults, which you've experienced yourself, what we found is not only that the young felt in a way, they were very happy for the opportunity, to be able to talk to someone who they, either deeply admire or they think highly of, or, simply didn't even know, that someone like this existed. But we've also had the speakers themselves express sort of, satisfaction, right? And some of them even say things like, we got questions that are sometimes better than what we got at academic conferences. That to me is, even if the person was probably saying it in a moment of lucidity, what is clear is that they got good questions. Whether they're better than here or there doesn't matter, but they got good questions, and which meant that the students had read the readings and they showed up ready for it, etc. So I think the overall, not just the public lectures, but also the exhibits, the the range of things we have, the Take It Further resources, the books, the games, the podcasts, etc. The engagement has been actually quite remarkable. I mean, we are ourselves surprised at how much engagement there is. Also, we offer the entire program in Kannada also, right? Like the entire exhibition website is available in
Kannada speaking.
Yes, because we're based in a Kannada speaking state. We're hoping to expand to other Indian languages also. So here's the other our turn to get surprised, as they say. So we have mediator-led sessions, right? Like where young people lead conversations about the exhibition and they show you through, walk you through the exhibition. 73% of our mediator-led sessions were in Indian languages.
Oh.
Which is,
it's
that's not a small number, right? And we did all 4 of the southern Indian languages, but we also did Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati. And that, that there was that degree of engagement felt kind of wow. So, it also tells us what we need to do going forward, right? So, to sum up, I think surprise is something we get. Deep engagement also, not only for the public lectures, but also the other things that we have is there. And also responses that were completely unanticipated. I mean, a kid left a response. I say a kid, I mean, a very young adult, like I think about 16 years of age, if I'm not mistaken, left a response saying, thank you for this. Now I'm going to go get vaccinated.
Wow.
No, now I'm convinced to go get vaccinated. And that was not the intention at all, right? Like nowhere in the exhibition do we put up anything.
To change some kind of behavior.
Change something in this person, right? Now, this is one person, but nonetheless, I mean, this is, you're going to go, wow, okay.
So you mentioned earlier, I think was epistemological justice used that word as a way of a kind of future of science and ways of listening and from everywhere, not only from Europe. So do you think that this kind of approach where you're breaking down boundaries, where you're creating multiple perspectives of the world we live in, from very different disciplinary aspects, and trying to reverse the late 19th century disciplinary modes, in a sense, you're trying to bring them and break the boundaries and saying, okay, here are many ways, you're putting like a kaleidoscope onto the same thing and opening. It's one way of leading to epistemological justice world as an underpinning of this, creating a more, well, if you want to use a less anthropogenic kind of position between man, science, nature, culture.
Yeah.
Because all of these are sort of coming together by choice also, but also as an outcome of just, using multiple languages, using multiple viewpoints, different questionings. These are all sort of embedded in those interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. So, one way, I wouldn't even say a way, right? Like, I think what we're doing is the foundational work required for any new way or any other ways to become possible. I think this is the foundational work required to identify things for what they are, right? Identify processes of knowledge making for what they are, understand how cultural authority of knowledge is established, why and how it is associational, that it is not in and of knowledge itself, but it's actually resides elsewhere, and why that matters, and therefore why history and context matters. So I think this is the work we are doing right now. And I think ways will come only after, in a way, that awareness is internalized, understood for what it is, and then the injustice, in a sense, becomes more clear, right? And it becomes obvious to do the next thing. So I think
it becomes like a model for contemporary education. In a sense, creating a new relationship between, I often argue that the climate crisis is so expert driven.
Yes.
It has to be communicated to the rest of us. And there's something in the way in which the methodology of what we call science production is so separate from people and how they know something, that we're always communicating science down instead of integrating science into the methodology of knowing itself.
Yes.
That knowledge creation is a co-creation of knowledge rather than, and I think that's a political question as well.
Absolutely.
And so why do we have to communicate climate change to people when it's evident increasingly to people around them? The fisher folks can see things happening around them.
Yeah.
There's no conversation. There's no way to assimilate what they know.
Yeah.
So do you think that in the future we'll find better ways of assimilating, of listening, and that's part of the justice question you raised. That how do we? Will that be possible? Will science become the culture of science become more varied than just the European idea of what knowledge is, in a sense?
So I think, one of the ideas at the foundation of the gallery for me is that good questions can come from anywhere. Good research questions can come from anywhere. And therefore then, knowledge that follows in trying to understand what the problem that is being posed. Having an insight into that is important. Now, again, I'll just say assimilating. I'll come back to something I said earlier, and it's a dangerous statement to make, but I hope you will indulge me and allow me the space to kind of, also retrieve and save myself towards the end, which is to say that all knowledges are not equal.
Right.
I'm not saying what the fisher folk on the coast know is not equal to what people know in the lab. That's not the an inequality I'm trying to establish here. But we'll have to be constantly alert to what kind of equalities we are establishing, equalities of truth claims we are accepting or establishing, right? So you're absolutely right in that the experience of people on the ground, like, with Ayla and the cyclone that followed in the Sundarban, or what's happening on people are experiencing it. What does that translate? What does that knowing translate to, right? What is it? In a sense, they know, and then there are other people who also know, right? Like, so people in the labs also know that coastal lines are rising, and places will submerge, and heat islands are growing, etc. So these people also know. These people also know. It doesn't stop there, right? Because neither are the people in the labs able to do have a follow-up consequence on their knowledge, nor are people who are experiencing have a serious say in the consequences of knowledge. Either of their knowledge is consequential.
Yeah.
Proving consequential, right? And so now, so this is why I said indulge me, because therefore to identify science as the problem, or knowing as the problem, or even ways of knowing as the problem, is problematic.
Right.
To use I'm saying to, the words are alliterating like mad. Is problematic. So where does the problem lie, right? Like, where are the bottlenecks? Where is it that the path gets narrow or constricting for anything to follow this knowing? Right? And I'm not going to again follow it up with a tried policymakers and politics. And I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that simple, right? Because on the one hand, there is an increasing push institutionally, and by institutionally I mean not only universities but the other institutions that prop up the world order and political economy as we understand today. There's a great push to replace knowledge making with problem solving, which is to my mind, as someone who's been in academia, dangerous and scary. So
you instrumentalize that.
Precisely. And that also, in a way, compromises your ability to know.
Correct.
Because you've already bracketed out things that might have consequences, right? And so who's important to solve that problem? So again, you'll not have you will identify those. So it shifts the burden from epistemic justice to then, other kinds of injustices, right? Like epistemic injustice to other kinds of injustices of inclusion and exclusion, right? So I mean, what does this call for? I have no idea, right? Like I have no idea what kind of an integration of knowing, doing, and living this calls for, right? But it does call for thinking again about where did, looking into the past and then looking into the future, right? Like, so not sort of start necessarily from here, but also know what choices we made in order to arrive where we have. Because nothing was inevitable in a way.
Yeah.
There's a choice, choices of very little was inevitable in a way. Right? So the choices we made. So how did we make those choices, right? Like what were universities for? What was industry for? What was, labor for? What was the family for? So I think, again, sort of think through decisions we've taken on these things, the relationship of the university to knowing, the relationship of the university to vocational education, the relationship of the university, which at some point didn't even have science, right? I mean, it had law and classics and, philology and whatnot, things like that, right? So to understand, again, for ourselves, why are we producing knowledge? Why does it matter to produce certain kinds of knowledge? And what are the problems we've created for ourselves? How are we going to solve them? Don't necessarily tie them to then saying now universities have to perform like puppets, or that, so also that's why that understanding precisely things that are happening is so important, because who do you move, right? Like which of your things needs to move in order for the queen to die, right? Or not die, whatever. So I think that, where is industry going to play that role? Where is, the responsibility of the university? Where is the responsibility of politics? Where is the, I think to some extent, to my mind, and that's also why I often don't write essays or, engage actively in fistfights with my colleagues very much, because I'm exhausted from doing all sorts of work, like all of us, right? And I don't have the energy to sit and dismantle everything that gets broad brushed into neoliberal, this, that, finished, right? And then everyone is painted with the same paintbrush. Universities are becoming corporatized, industry is like this, science is extractive, politics is corrupt, finished.
Yeah. Story over before it's done.
Yes. So, so the only thing I can feel at the end of it is like hopeless, because even people who know and who I have, how should I say, intellectual affinities with, I'm not even able to sit and unpack things with them, right? So I think, so that's why I think, that it's really like that, like brick by brick, stone by stone. I mean, what I say is foundational work. I mean, we're doing one thing. We're one tiny institution. How much can we do? But even for this to do the work, it has to do at the fidelity to the goals I think we have imagined. It'll take I won't be alive by the time sort of the bulk of it will be realized, right? And the ground is slipping, right? Like we are losing debates on a daily basis. We've lost ground on a daily basis. I mean, I don't feel hopeless. I still feel kind of, I still feel there is reason to do this work.
Yeah, there is. I think more now than ever before.
More now than ever. Completely.
Yeah.
Completely.
I think the fact you're doing it also shows that something is coming to a limit. Some things are coming into question because there are many limits being hit across the world, including what we call the ecological crisis. Again, a sweeping statement that we call so that those trajectories have led us to certain limits. Also cause to question what is embedded in those trajectories, the questions, the intentions, and the methodologies. What did they serve? And do we need to ask a different set of questions?
Yes.
Will that require a realignment of the methodologies? Because you're talking of asymmetries of knowledge, local and the asymmetries, but the symmetries are not just assuming they're all equal, but symmetries are finding the methodological symmetries and finding a way forward. So we are, in that sense, because of the moment in time.
Yes.
And that moment in time in historical terms could be extend over 100 years, maybe.
Absolutely.
But that moment in time is saying that there's another thing being called for.
Yes.
We're at the point of exhaustion of where we were, and we are on to a place of new recovery. So in that sense, what you're doing is pioneering. In that sphere, you're at the tip of the megaphone. What might go to something else, the new wave. And I really do believe that. I think that this is the moment in which people like you and other people who are questioning, and this conversation we are doing, is really embedded in questioning the history thus far.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, apart from your kind words for the work I'm doing, I think what I must say, this is not an idea or an effort before its time, in a sense. It is of the moment. And I think that is something I'm acutely aware of. It's literally an idea, not even whose time has come. It's the idea of this time, right? It belongs. And it's a coming together of all the work that all of us do, right? Some quietly, some more loudly, some more articulately, some less, intensely, whatever it is. I think it's of this moment. I mean, it's 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined this.
Yeah.
And 10 years from now, it's going to be too late. Right? Yeah. So I think it's very much now.
I think the seeds are being, not only here in the new academic thinking around this, the Anthropocene is a good placeholder for marking something, even if you disagree with when it started, but as a moment in time, it's a marker of what is to follow. All the questions which are coming up now were not there 10 years back.
Absolutely.
These are new questions, and they're across the board in a sense.
Yeah.
So in that sense, when you bring up methodological questions through your exhibitions, of the process questions in your exhibitions, you are both creating a new understanding, but you're also letting people see the boundaries of those methodologies and questions, so that other boundaries can merge and co-merge or take off from there, in a sense. If you don't know the detail, you don't know this. This is the detail on the ground work which is required in our education system.
Yeah.
And I think this is fantastic. So I think this is, it's not about looking at science, it's about what you do with that looking, how you look at it, for what purpose, which is more important, I think.
Absolutely.
It's a project of the future, I think, and of now.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of the time, and I'm sure we're going to have other conversations, maybe next face-to-face over a coffee. I'd love to carry many of these thoughts, which there's no time to bring on right now, which you mentioned. It's been a fascinating conversation, Jahnavi. Thank you very much for it. And really a peek into your process and your mind about this. So thank you very much for sharing them with me.
Thank you, Ravi, for the opportunity to pontificate, but also to share, I think in many ways uncensored, why I do what I do, and how what we do belongs together in a sense, and so I think also feeling that connection, feeling that camaraderie is very important, because at the end of it, we're all in this together, and together is the only way forward. So I'm delighted that I had the chance to discuss this with you.
No, it's all mine. Pleasure all mine. Thank you, Jahnavi.
Thank you, Tom.